plenary session. I'm going to give very brief introductions to the speakers because, and I'm going to post it again now. I've got some speaker bios, speaker bios in the Google Drive folder that everybody can have access to, the longer version of the bios, not very long, nice pretty pictures and all. But briefly, we have Oren here, who's the Executive Director of American Compass and author of The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, that I suspect will provide the basis for many of his comments here today. And then we'll have Damon Silvers, who's the Director of Policy and Special Counsel for the AFL-CIO, and has spent much of his career with organized labor or in the federal government in various capacities. So we're going to, I think everyone's kind of looking forward to a bit of contention, maybe a little fireworks, but I do want to note that we're here, these two people, we brought these two people together in part because I think there's actually a fair bit of common ground on the deteriorating position of American workers. Work does not have the security or dignity or stature that it had in the past and that it probably needs to have to form the foundation for a cohesive society. So there, I do think that's a point of agreement from what I've gathered from the speakers. But let's hear first from Oren on his view of how to move forward to a better future for working people.
You are muted, Oren.
There we go. I need a sign that says 3 days since I last forgot to unmute on my Zoom, I guess. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here and especially excited to have this conversation with Damon. I guess I'll start my remarks in Bessemer, which I think sort of provides a snapshot of, to some extent, where the labor movement, especially in the private sector, stands today. It was an organizing campaign that obviously received enormous attention. It was a quintessential illustration of the kind of workplace where unionization might make sense, both given the challenges those workers faced and given the nature of the firm's business. And yet the organizing campaign failed quite spectacularly. I believe the final count was fewer than 750 yes votes out of more than 6,000, or about 6,000 workers. And I think certainly there are complaints of some abuses by Amazon that are still being litigated. But I also think it's difficult to suggest that when fewer than 1 in 6 workers vote yes over 2 months, that what the union was offering was really what workers were looking for. At the same time, I think we obviously have a problem on the right of center with some folks who would crow about that result and say, see, there you go, workers don't need unions, they love their jobs at Amazon. First of all, Amazon has a very long track record of poor labor practices, and today the only real check on them is public relations embarrassment. And more generally, the premise of a union, the premise of workers organizing is not only to fight for some particular wage. Workers want to have voice in the workplace. They want to have representation. They want to have the ability to provide mutual support. They want solidarity. They want opportunities for training and benefits that in many cases a union can help provide. And so we should not celebrate, I think, the failure of the campaign as a sign that organized labor isn't important or isn't wanted. I think to the contrary, we need to look at the situation and see it as a mismatch, as a disconnect between what a labor movement that is to a large extent operating on 1930s principles under a 1930s statutory framework and workers in the 21st century economy. And I think we actually have a lot of data from workers to support this. Richard Freeman at Harvard University did some very interesting work in the 1990s, in particular published in a book called What Workers Want, that asked workers what they want. And in my mind, the most striking finding is from a question he asked workers whether they would prefer a situation where they were able to collaborate with management but had no real power, or a form of organized labor that gave them more power, but that management opposed. And workers preferred the collaboration, no power formulation by roughly 3-to-1. And that held even for workers in unions. Thomas Cochin at MIT has done some follow-up work as recently as 2017 that provided workers with a very long menu of options for different types of things that unions might provide to workers. And essentially everything on the list workers said they wanted and would make them more likely to join a union, with the exception of two. One was involvement in politics, and the other was strikes. And so again, I think, we see that the idea of conflict and the more sort of political texture that a lot of labor activity has come to undertake is simply not consistent with what workers might want from a labor union. Now, I think conservatives need to do a much better job coming to this discussion. I think right now we have a situation where the left of center is quite committed to essentially the existing model, I would say for political as much as economic reasons. And the right of center has taken a position that they will simply cheer the demise of a system that doesn't work. At American Compass, one of the arguments that we've worked hard to advance, particularly among conservatives, is to emphasize the reasons why conservatives, while they might not like unions the way they operate today, should want to see a vibrant labor movement. And we underscore three in particular. The first is that a robust labor movement, real power for workers in the labor market, is a much better way to spread prosperity widely than is redistribution. The philosophy that a rising tide will automatically lift all boats and anything that generates growth ultimately redounds to workers' benefits has been clearly disproven in recent decades. And so as between allowing workers to advance their own interests in the workplace or using government to redistribute, I think conservatives would strongly and rightly prefer the former. Second is with respect to governance of the workplace. Again, the right of center is sort of defaulted to a view that we should simply leave employers to govern the workplace however they want. But I don't think that's desirable, and it's also not plausible. If workers are not able to bargain with employers and set the terms and conditions in their workplaces, then government bureaucrats are going to do that. And so I think this is something we see in Europe in particular, where a more robust labor movement is actually a quite strong bulwark against government intervention and regulation in the workplace. And so again, that is the mechanism that conservatives should prefer. And then third is that stepping beyond the workplace as a matter of community strength and social capital, labor organizations are one of the strongest sources available, especially with respect to the working class. And I think the decline of labor in this country over the last 50 years is closely tied to many of the challenges faced in working class communities, and that a form of labor that workers were eager to participate in, and that in turn provided real benefit to them, I think could be a very positive force. So for all three of those reasons, we push the right of center to really join this conversation and say, here is a form of labor that might work better than what we have now. And I think there are a bunch of directions that conversation might go. One option, I think, is, and one important distinction is separating out private sector from public sector labor. I think it is an unfortunate phenomenon of our politics in particular, that the labor movement has increasingly become a public sector phenomenon when the case for it there, I think, is much weaker, and I think its operation there is much less constructive. And so I think a labor movement focused much more on the private sector, and that empowered the private sector workforce in return for limiting its power in the public sector workforce would be a very useful trade. I think another area that's worth discussing is moving the level of negotiation out of the enterprise and up to the industry level. The U.S. is something of an outlier in its enterprise-based bargaining system, and I think a more sectoral bargaining system would go a long way toward meeting some of the concerns that workers have about conflict in the workplace, and meeting some of the concerns that employers have that when you are unionized and your competition isn't, that can be a real problem. And so I think that's a shift that is potentially quite constructive, and one that there are plenty of ways to move toward, whether that's starting in particular places, starting in particular industries, or starting with particular topics. And then certainly with a sectoral bargaining model, or even in its absence, I think creating other forms of worker representation, for instance, works councils, that give workers real voice and representation and an opportunity to collaborate, but without some of the elements of unionization that they are less enthusiastic about, could be very positive as well. The final piece that I would love to see more conversation around is other types of benefits that labor can provide. And this is more akin to the Ghent system in Europe, but looking for opportunities to run more public sector programs, whether that's social benefits like unemployment insurance, training programs, actually using union membership and union infrastructure as a mechanism for providing those kinds of benefits. I think that would be a constructive role, and again, a pathway toward strengthening the movement in a way that doesn't bring with it some of the dysfunction that we have today. So all of those are, I think, some of the topics there is beginning to be more interesting on the right of center, and certainly the things my hope would be that the left of center and those involved in the labor movement would be eager to discuss as well. And I guess that leads into Damon's own thoughts on the question.
Yes, as the very first respondent from the left of center and labor movement perspective, we'd like to hear from Damon on what Oren might be missing, or what the labor movement, how the labor movement might see things differently.
All right, well, great, great, Cynthia. First, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be with this group. I was looking through the attendees. We've got some of the most distinguished thinkers in this space in the country, with us, listening, which I'm honored. Secondly, I just want to note LERA.
We've lost you, Damon.
Do this together here, and in particular, I think to have the conversation that Oren and I are sort of privileged to launch. In certain respects,
Damon, just so you know, you're very glitchy and freezing, and if you might want to leave the meeting and come right back, and maybe turn off
rebalancing.
anything else that's taking bandwidth.
Sorry.
You're very glitchy and freezing, and you might want to leave the meeting and come right back, and maybe turn off anything that's taking up bandwidth at your place.
Is that I'm just turning off the video. That's the easiest way to deal with that. Does that help?
That does help.
Okay. So what I was saying was that I think this is one of the most important conversations that can be had in our country right now. Not a conversation, a sort of set piece argument that goes over old ground between labor and management, but rather a conversation that begins with a common recognition that we have some serious problems of underlying economic and social instability and political instability in our society that needs solutions, and that those are problems that any thoughtful person looking at American society could agree exist, and that for which historically those kinds of problems in modern societies have been significantly effectively addressed by workers having rights, rights isn't the right word, from its structures of social solidarity among working people and structures that enable working people to have real voice and bargaining power, both in their communities and in their workplaces. So I think sort of Oren has sort of set the table in a really positive way for a critical conversation that this is a great forum to have in. Now, I think the real, and I would also say that I think that some level of that Oren listed a group of things where he thought there should be more discussion, many of which have been put forward as sort of alternatives to unions and to collective bargaining in a way that I think is, in a way that I frankly think is misplaced. I don't see. I know that some people on the right see it that way. I don't, for starters, see public sector and private sector unions as at odds with each other, but rather mutually, they kind of go together. I mean, it's a very striking fact how much the attack on public sector unionism in the Midwest that was launched by Scott Walker in Wisconsin 10 years ago, how much its economic and political foundations had to do with the hollowing out of private sector unionism during the prior 20 years since NAFTA. That if the state of Wisconsin, with the political economy and the workforce composition that it had in 1992, would no more have elected Scott Walker and the legislature that supported him in 2010 than they would have elected Hezbollah, but the much more unequal and deindustrialized Wisconsin of 2010, post financial crisis, was a very different matter indeed. Similarly, there's been a lot of conversation about sectoral bargaining among labor intellectuals over the last few years, and most of which is conducted in complete kind of ignorance of the fact that the labor movement throughout its modern history in the United States has sought to achieve sectoral bargaining, to have industry-wide negotiations at every turn. However, and I think you'll see this as a persistent tension here in my response to Oren's remarks. However, that sectoral bargaining was founded on a foundation of enterprise-based democratic and hopefully to a large degree real worker organization in actual workplaces. And again, it's an example of how things that are put forward that are sometimes put forward as alternatives to traditional form to unions and collective bargaining are in fact varieties of unions and collective bargaining, or emanate from having healthy work organizations and healthy collective bargaining structures at the enterprise level. The same thing, I think, is fundamentally true, truly true about works councils. Actually, existing works councils in the European context are almost completely dependent on underlying structures of collective bargaining and the underlying strength or weakness of actual labor unions. And the same thing, I think, is basically true of the Ghent system in that it's not an alternative. And I'm not sure that Oren would disagree with me. It's not really an alternative to unions. It is a means of expanding and strengthening a principle that Oren didn't mention, but that I think underlies Oren's remarks, which is sort of notions of in Catholic social thought, notions of subsidiarity. The idea that we should be looking to more decentralized, more local institutions to solve social problems when they can. So I think with that introduction, then the question is, how do we get from the current situation, which I think Oren and I agree is not a good one, not for working people and not for our society. How do we get from the current situation where private sector union density is 6.7%, and overall union density in the labor market is just over 10%? How do we get to a labor relations system where working people actually have some voice, some power, some autonomy, both in the workplace and in the larger society? Now, as you can probably tell, before my internet signal deteriorated, the labor movement is unified, completely unified, as a public policy matter behind the PRO Act as our agenda for restoring workers' right to organize and bargain with some degree of reality. And we are anticipating there will be a public sector companion bill to the PRO Act being introduced in a few weeks. And while that bill hasn't been introduced, and therefore I can't say that the AFL-CIO endorses it, I'm highly confident that that will be the case and that there will be complete labor movement unity behind that bill in addition. The PRO Act is a substantially broader piece of legislation than earlier attempts at labor law reform in our time. The Employee Free Choice Act was very focused on union elections. The PRO Act gets at both the organizing context and the bargaining context. It includes a ban on striker replacements. It includes a ban on so-called right-to-work bills that are designed to dismantle social solidarity in the workplace, have their origins in segregationist politics in the South in the 1940s. It repeals the Taft-Hartley's Act's ban on secondary strikes and boycotts. It's a fundamental change, not just in organizing, but in bargaining, and it's designed to rebuild social solidarity in the American workplace and American society, and to rebalance the balance of power in the workplace and in the larger labor market. And the question is that I think Oren poses is this an attempt to create a conflict-ridden labor relations environment? And I think that the history of the United States and the history of other developed countries shows that there are clear pathways to high union density political economies that are not fundamentally conflict-ridden. That is definitely the history of the sort of the modern era, both in Japan, in Germany, in Northern Europe more generally, and there are different stories at different times in other countries with higher levels of union density. The question, I think, is not that. I think in the American labor market and the American society today, there is a clear pathway to a kind of win-win labor relations environment. The question is how to get from what the business community perceives to be, and particularly the low-wage business community perceives to be, a stable low-wage environment to that environment with a minimum of conflict. And the PRO Act and the political process around it offers a pathway, if there was an ability for robust dialogue around some of the issues that Oren has raised, if there was ability for robust dialogue that reached across partisan lines, to reach people who care about the fate of the American worker in both parties, we could move in a fundamentally positive direction in our country. I'll note that people listening to me may think, well, he's absolutely crazy, right? That's just not what's happening in Washington today, and it couldn't possibly happen. I will note for you that on Friday in New Hampshire, a push funded by the National Right to Work Committee and other kind of out-of-state business interests to pass right to work in New Hampshire. That push was defeated, and it was largely defeated through the leadership of Republican legislators who were either active or retired union members or came from union families, and whose basic attitudes, because I know some of them, basic attitudes are not very different from the views that Oren expressed just now in this session. And so the real challenge, I think, from an analytical perspective and from a kind of how can we go forward from here perspective, is can we make this dialogue a more robust one and a more politically meaningful one? The political space that exists between, as Cynthia said, the center left and the center right, if that's what we choose to be labeled, Oren and myself, if that political space could be not a space of division, but a space of dialogue, our country would be, I think, in far better, the prospects of our country's future would be far better. The labor movement is, in our campaign for the PRO Act, is not assuming that anyone is our friend or our enemy. We have currently 47 co-sponsors in the Senate. We are looking particularly at 3 Democrats and 1 Republican as the likely 48, 49, and 50. And we all understand, I think, that 50 is the magic number here, not 60. And those are, we are looking for them among both Republicans and Democrats. What I think is really not helpful, though, is the notion that somehow, as Frederick Douglass said something once, which I can't repeat, act with completely from memory, but basically he said, you know, those who want justice without struggle want lightning without the thunder without the lightning. And I would just say that you can't look for solutions to the problem that Oren is talking about without getting at questions of power. And power can be redistributed through high or low conflict measures. Healthy societies are able to do so through relatively low conflict measures and through dialogue. And I think today gives me a little bit of hope that perhaps we could go that path. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks so much, Damon. Oren, you've got a few minutes to give a bit of a rejoinder and mix it up a little.
Sure. I think, as Damon said, there are certainly areas of agreement that we have with respect to what a healthier system of labor could look like. My concern is that it's not clear to me what folks within the labor movement are prepared to change. The PRO Act, I think, is a very good example of a piece of legislation that, as far as I'm aware, does not do anything to address any of the dysfunctions of the labor movement. It doesn't do anything to reduce conflict within places of employment. It doesn't do anything to reduce the role of politics within the labor movement. It doesn't do anything to reduce sort of strike-based conflict. In fact, it allows secondary boycotts. And so I think for folks on the right of center, and frankly, a lot of workers, if they think about the options they have, what the bill looks like is essentially a way to get more people into the existing system. And so I think if we're going to make progress, what we're going to need is a combination that says we want to get more people into a system, but we also recognize that that we need to make changes to the system. And so that would be one question I pose back to Damon, whether it's within the PRO Act and I'm not aware of it or elsewhere. What are the things that frankly have not worked well in the labor movement in recent decades that we can potentially, pursue some change in? And then I think the second thing that I would emphasize is that we really do need to take a look at the role that that partisan politics is playing in the labor movement. Workers and particularly lower wage and working class workers across racial groups, I think, are increasingly diverse in their political views and split somewhat evenly between the parties to a significant degree. And so a system in which labor is still perceived as, and in some cases is, essentially an instrument of the Democratic Party is going to be incompatible with a system that that both workers and political leaders on the right of center are interested in strengthening. I think that was certainly an undercurrent of Bessemer. And Damon mentioned the logo over his shoulder, so I will as well. It's literally Joe Biden and the Democratic Party's slogan. So I think another really important question as we think about how do we actually meet workers where they are and provide them what they want is how do we get a labor movement that is more focused on the kind of representation and voice in the workplace and power in the labor market that is not as directly focused on and correlated with partisan politics, which are obviously not a bright point in our in our nation at the moment. So those are two places I would love to explore in the conversation. Is one, what are the actual changes we're going to make to how the labor movement operates, not just how do we get more people into existing unions, and then second is how do we feel about the alignment with partisan politics and can and should that be an area for change as well.
So I'm going to go to Damon in just one second, but I want to point out that there's a theme emerging in the comments already in the chat section that will probably be the first set of questions for Oren, like who on the side of employers and Republicans, who's the audience? Is there a receptive audience out there for these proposals, especially sectoral bargaining? But let's go to Damon next.
Okay. So first, make sure you can hear me, both hear and see me. Is the audio okay now? All right, good. Well, look, let me first say that I think the question, Cynthia, that you posed is really the critical one right now, right? There is no proposal coming from the Republican Party's sort of the people who are kind of flirting with the idea that the Republican Party ought to be speaking to working class people. There is no proposal to counterpose to the PRO Act. I can tell you that I think it is unlikely that the AFL-CIO would immediately adopt such a proposal, but I think it would be a very helpful thing to interact with, right? The prospects of actually getting somewhere really, I think, rests on the part of people in the Republican Party, Lisa Murkowski, or the groups that the senators that have interacted with American Compass and taken part in some of American Compass's work, to put something out there, right? It doesn't have to be anything I agree with, but it would be really helpful for the country to be able to have a dialogue about different visions of where American workers should go. If you ask me, though, to critique the history of the recent history of the American labor movement, I think that fundamentally there are two things that we need to be mindful of, and one is how critical it is that what unions do and do successfully is empower working people, that workers organize when they feel they have a shot at actually getting some power, and that the cost will not be the loss of their jobs, the loss of their homes, a level of conflict forced on them by their employer, by the way. The first thing that every employer does in an organizing drive is seek to lift the level of conflict up, because normal people don't want to live in an environment of conflict. Right? Somebody taught me that, by the way, when I was 23 years old in my first union job, to understand that that's how union elections work. The person who taught me that is Chris Rondo. I believe she's known to people on this call, who is somebody that everyone ought to listen to around these issues, in my opinion. So I think that the labor movements, and I think that many advocates of substitutionalism, meaning substituting the state for labor organizations, which I think is a risk when in some versions of sectoral bargaining. I think these things miss the point of how important it is that working people feel empowered. and that the meaning of key events in labor history, like the sit-down strikes or the I Am a Man strike in Memphis with Dr. King, where Dr. King was killed, standing with sanitation workers. The meaning of those events were they created a sense of hope and power that led other people to organize, and that to some degree the labor movement has missed that focus in trying to think about growth in recent years, and has instead focused on either simply political levers or on various kinds of technical approaches to organizing. The second thing I would say is that, you know, about looking at our past is that all too often the labor movement missed the really kind of what was really important that was going on in the political economy of the United States and globally, that was going to really hurt working people and really hurt the labor movement, and our eyes were focused elsewhere. And partisan identity, partisan politics was not a very good way of understanding those dynamics during the last 30 years. Certainly, many people in both parties over the last 30 years promised that they would stand up for working people, and then engaged in policy actions that fundamentally gutted worker bargaining power, or stood aside while American business executed business strategies that first gutted worker bargaining power and then destabilized American society and American politics. Keeping our eye on what is actually in working people's interest is something that I think the elected leaders I work for at the AFL-CIO are very focused on. And I can tell you, we did not adopt the slogan behind my head idly or casually. The agenda that we see President Biden executing is a pro-worker agenda. I can't say that about every Democratic president in my lifetime, but this man means business. And if you doubt that, just ask around for the former general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. Find out what he's up to and how he feels. So that's my response. But I think my response to sort of my critique of the labor movement is not really what's important here. What's important here is, how do we get this dialogue about among people who agree on certain very important fundamentals? I would say that Oren and I actually do agree on some very important fundamentals. How do we get that dialogue to be real and not to be one-sided? Right? What are the methods by which it will be possible to have and by the way, there have been times in American politics over the last 100 years where this has been far more true than today, where there have been more sort of right of center and more left of center versions of labor policy and labor politics in a constructive way. How do we get this going? Because without that, I'm concerned about how we sort of solve the underlying problems Oren was talking about earlier. I will say, though, that some things really are bad mistakes. All right, and I think if on the one hand, one kind of mistake is the idea that we can build a new labor movement that's fundamentally an expression of the state. That is not going to work. It's not going to work for a ton of different reasons. The labor movement has to be an expression of working people, not of the power of the state. The state's important, as you know, to help working people, to support working people, but it can't substitute for actual working people, expressing themselves. The other, I think, thing we really need to avoid is the idea that we can reinvent the labor movement as a kind of HR aid, as a supplement to Amazon's or somebody else or Uber's HR department. And I think we've seen some people sort of suggest that at various times. I'm not saying that's what Oren is saying, but I think that idea, and the idea that somehow that will evolve into a real labor movement, which did happen in some company unions in the 1930s, but only against the background of a gigantic and militant, genuine labor movement pushing them. So I think those two models, which have been floated on occasion by both people in and around the labor movement, people who've been in the labor movement and then gone to work for big companies, and by academics. Those two models are fundamental wrong turns, dead ends, and not just because. And I'm not saying that just because obviously the AFL-CIO institutionally has been against those ideas for decades, but because I don't think they will address the fundamental injustice and imbalance in our labor market that's destabilizing our democracy.
So I think you've teed up the next question nicely for Oren, but we've all seen the comments over here and they kind of continue largely on this theme of is there any receptivity on the Republican side and among employers to ideas for actually empowering workers? And I'll put my own little spin on it. If the labor movement were to overcome its own misgivings somehow about your proposals and just say, okay, this will be a first step. We're going to jump in, you know, feet first, and all the way in on sectoral bargaining, works councils, etc. My suspicion is that that would only harden. We'd go from indifference on the Republican side to sharper opposition. How do you, and I guess I'm just paraphrasing Damon here, how is it possible to get employers and Republican lawmakers interested in constructive proposals that actually do empower workers?
You know, I think we're certainly at the very beginning of this process. And so, you know, when you think about the sequencing of it, it runs sort of from some wonky folks like me, typically, up to those who are really sort of engaged in the day-to-day, and then finally to the actual politicians. I think that's not a comment about labor policy. I think that's generally the way that we see change in the policy environment over time. And so, you know, my assessment of where we are on that right now is actually quite far along on sort of step 2 of 3. So, you know, we coordinated a statement that American Compass put out in September, essentially making this argument about the need for the right of center to rethink and focus on these things. And had a very interesting group of signatories. So if you think of, you know, electeds, it was just Senator Marco Rubio, who I think is generally kind of furthest along on thinking about some of these worker-related concerns. J.D. Vance, who's very likely running for Senate in Ohio, also was a signatory to it, as was former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, which is sort of an interesting Alabama angle on the whole thing. But then behind that, you had the leaders of a bunch of right of center think tanks, everything from, you know, American Compass, Yuval Levin at AEI, Eli Lehrer at R Street, Terry Schilling at the American Principles Project, Michael Toscano at the Institute for Family Studies, as well as some very experienced practitioners. So Bill Kilberg, the head of the practice at Gibson Dunn, was a signatory. Roger King, senior counsel to the HR Policy Institute, was a signatory. And so I think those are the sorts of folks who are sort of right now leading the conversation. And when you then go to meetings on the Hill, I can say 2 things. One, there are an awful lot of these meetings going on. It's something that I think there's a lot of interest in discussing and trying to understand. And second, something that I find really encouraging is that the nature of the conversation isn't so much about persuading as it is about informing. That is that, you know, when we brought our statement, for instance, around to various Hill offices to talk with folks about it, there was a lot of interest and enthusiasm at the staff level. And the feedback typically was, you know, our boss thinks this is really interesting, but he or she isn't ready to do this. Not that he or she disagrees, but this isn't something we've ever really talked about before. And so, you know, as we think about what we're trying to do from the outside, I think it's to a large extent an informing process and a process of sort of defining the opportunity set so people can become more comfortable with it. I think over the next, you know, probably talking 3 to 5 years and a couple of election cycles, we'll start to see a significant number of folks on the right of center talking about, electeds talking about this publicly. The last thing I would just say about it, though, is when you think about, okay, what would a proposal look like? It's not just going to be, we should add sectoral bargaining, we should add co-determination, we should add this or that. It is going to come with it a view that there are things about the system today that really need to change, and in ways that are not friendly to the existing labor movement. So, whether that's, we also need to have a Team Act style works council option for workers who might opt for that, whether that's, we really need to go to a more clear division between funding of the economic activities of unions and any potential political activities. As I mentioned, from the right of center perspective, at least, the idea of saying, yes, we do want to empower private sector unions, but that kind of empowerment cannot extend to public sector unions, is something that I think will be really important to folks. And so that sort of brings me back to the question I posed, which I don't think Damon really answered, which is there any room for bargaining in the theme of collective bargaining? Is there, when I look at something like the PRO Act, I say, yes, absolutely, there should be much harsher penalties for employers that commit unfair labor practices. I think that's an obviously important and sensible principle. But on the flip side, I also think there should be options for workers who want to do something that's not a formal union. So is there a package that says, we're going to create the space for works councils, but also have greater enforcement of organizing rights? Those are the kinds of proposals I think you're likely to see from the right of center. And my sense is that at least today, there isn't a lot of receptivity for anything but PRO Act style kind of this plus more from within the labor movement.
So that actually feeds nicely into the one question I had for Damon, which goes back to one of the very first things that Oren talked about, and that's the famous Freeman and Rogers study on what workers want. And in particular, that question, which I've highlighted in some of my own writings about the very, very large majority of workers who express a preference for organizations that work with employers, even if they don't have power, versus an organization that has power, but that employers oppose. That's from people who had no interest in dumping on unions by a long shot. And it's been reaffirmed, I think, in subsequent studies. And it does create, from all that you've been saying, Damon, from much that we see around us, a huge dilemma. How do you go about building worker power if workers, a huge majority of workers kind of draw back when they see conflict? And employers from their side, of course, use that strategically, right? They know that one of the best ways to oppose a union drive is to make the union drive the source of conflict. And yet, so how do we go forward with that dilemma?
Well, Cynthia, I think, can I may find these two things I'm going to say a little bit in tension, but I think that's life in the big city. On the one hand, I would say this to Oren, like, nobody gets anywhere in the labor movement by negotiating with ourselves. If there's someone to negotiate with in the center right, like, let them show up. If Marco Rubio wants to actually play in this game, let him show up on the field. We would welcome the some other players on the field, truly. And I think some of the things that you're talking about, would be viewed very hostilely by the elected leaders of the labor movement. Others would be viewed sort of with open minds, some even positively. I think in order to understand how that would go, somebody would have to show up, but they would have to represent votes, not goodwill, but actual votes. In particular at this moment in the Senate of the United States. Because right now, and this goes to a question that was posed in the chat, right now, what the game is in the larger sense, getting to 50 votes in the Senate of the United States, and those 50 votes meaning it. right? We know by the whole that the whole 60 vote thing is a mirage. It's an illusion. It's just 50 votes who mean it, and that's kind of how the Republicans governed when they had the Senate, and I think increasingly that's how the Democrats are going to govern. And we have no intention of watering down the PRO Act in order to get to 60, or watering down the PRO Act in order to get to some artificial procedural barrier that would turn it into trivial things that wouldn't change the balance of power in the American workplace. But we are definitely interested in talking with people who have maybe some common values and some common ultimate goals, but different ideas about how to get there. And frankly, I put Oren in that category, and anybody that might come to the table with Oren's type of ideas. It's just there's nobody on the other side. Now, that's about the policymaking environment. Cynthia, your question, I think, is a profound question, right? And I think that data has been deeply, deeply misinterpreted down the years. Right? People do not like conflict. If offered the choice of life with conflict or life without conflict, all but there are a few of us who enjoy conflict, but not very many. Right? And people particularly don't like conflict they're going to lose. And if you asked American workers in 1995 about conflict in the workplace and strikes, after what had just happened, after Paul Volcker and Eastern Airlines and the Reagan Labor Board, right? And God, strike after lost strike in the 1980s with striker replacements and National Guard guns behind them. You ask people, well, how do you feel about workplace conflict? And what's summoned in their mind is job loss, home loss, community destruction. I'll take oppression over that kind of conflict. On the other hand, if you'd asked a veteran of the sit-down strikes, how do you feel about workplace conflict? Right? Their typical response was, because we know what it was, because we know that they engaged in it over and over again over the years that followed, was bring it on. My life was tremendously better after me and my coworkers had the courage to stand up than it was before we did. Bring it on. Right? It depends really completely on whether or not you believe that you have power. Now, if you can get to a stable balance of power, then conflict is unnecessary. And we may not have liked it. I make lots of critiques of it. The post-war collective bargaining system, J.D. Vance's grandparents, who were the heroes of his book, were the beneficiaries of that system, loved it. The post-war bargaining system managed conflict down to a level that everybody seemed to be able to live with until larger economic pressures kind of destabilized it in the 1970s. One could imagine, and other countries, very productive and successful economies, have balances of power in the workplace that are supportive of their democratic polities and have relatively low levels of conflict. But as I said earlier, the challenge that the United States faces is to move from a situation where there is no conflict because one side has their foot on the other side's neck, to a system in which there is no conflict because people are dealing with each other from a position of relative equality and relative mutual dignity. How do you get from one to the other without conflict? Right? That is, or with manageable conflict. Through ordinary political processes and that sort of thing. That is the question in front of us. But I think to point to that data and say people prefer to have no power, people prefer to be powerless, people prefer not to be paid what their work is worth, which is what the wage productivity gap tells us. That people prefer those things. They prefer to be serfs. That's not right. What they prefer is not to be slaughtered by their lords. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, and to understand that ultimately really profoundly inequitable power relations are not stable, and that's what we're living in right now. That the workplace balance of power that was set in place by the mid-1990s when that study was done, that imbalance of power in the workplace led inexorably to January 6th, inexorably. In terms of the perception of large numbers of Americans that their political system and their economy was in the hands of unaccountable, sinister forces. All right, one leads to the other. And the question is, how do we get out of it? And I find this conversation, as complex as it is, to be hopeful. Like, together, I have no doubt that the ideas represented by Oren and myself are capable of being resolved and leading the country forward. We just have to do it.
So, Oren, I know you have some things of your own to say to that. I just wanted to point out, because I don't seem to have been maybe bringing in other comments. We are bringing in the comments in the chat function, because they're many of them are very much in line with this. Is there anything that the Republican side, and we didn't used to be able to simplify it that much, but we can now. The Republican side is willing to concede that would actually give workers more power at work vis-a-vis their employers?
Well, I think, again, if you're talking about something like going up to something that is more sectoral in nature, that's certainly a way that you give workers more power. I think if you look at what Senator Rubio said about the Amazon organizing campaign, one of the other kind of very interesting dynamics in all of this is the degree to which the Republican Party is sort of undergoing a divorce from management in a sense. And so, that I think is another kind of very interesting, very interesting dynamic that is going to continue to play out. But, as I said, I don't think there are a lot of elected Republicans at this point who are kind of out there with proposals. I think they're at the start of a process, but that they are in fact noticing the importance of labor market power. I mean, to take kind of a related example, a lot of the immigration fight comes down to worker power. And I know the economists will fight about whether or not it's the case and so on and so forth. But certainly immigration policy is an area where Republicans have spoken very explicitly about wanting to give workers more power. If you look at Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton's bill introducing both, I think it was an $11 or a $10 an hour federal minimum wage plus E-Verify, it very explicitly said we want workers to have more power in the labor market, and we think these are two provisions, both of which will do that. So I think the idea that workers should have more power is something you see an increasing number of Republicans coming around to. The idea that giving existing labor unions like the ones that Damon represents more power is the way to do that is something that Republicans are unlikely to come around to. And frankly, that I have my concerns about as well. And so, that's why I think this question of also how do we separate labor power from partisan politics has to be a piece of the solution somehow. We could wish a world where it's not, but I think in the world that we live in, it's definitely a piece of the puzzle as well. And so, in my mind, the key project, particularly with folks on the right of center, is to say, look, there's clearly an increased understanding that more power for workers in the labor market is a good thing. Organizing is obviously one of the ways to do that. How can we find modes of organizing that accomplish what the right of center also wants, which is more power for workers, without delivering what the right of center worries about, which is one, an aggressive left of center political edifice, to the kind of conflict that workers say they don't want in the workplace, and three, also the sort of competitive problems that we've certainly seen in the economy in recent decades. And so I think that's kind of where the solution set is. The final thing I'd say is that a place where Damon and I probably greatly disagree is on what's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement here. The union movement's view at this point seems to be that the PRO Act can pass. I certainly disagree with that assessment just as a matter of what is going on in Congress. And it seems to me that the default trajectory we are on is the continued fade into irrelevance of the private sector labor movement. which has been the story for a very long time. And so while I appreciate Damon's point that there need to be people coming forward from the right of center to negotiate with, I think that is entirely fair and certainly something I want to work with. I would just say conversely that there needs to be there needs to be with some willingness within the labor movement to say, gosh, some things are going to have to change here, because if everyone just stays in their corners, I don't see a wonderful future for the American labor movement. I see a very tragic demise.
So unfortunately, I'm going to have to close this for many reasons. For one, I have another session coming up immediately. I think there's an appetite out there in the audience. If the speakers want to hang around in the plenary room for a little bit, that would be fine. That would be great. But I also want to point out that LERA as an organization is exactly the right forum in which to continue this conversation. And it would be great to have more point, counterpoint, and potential compromise type conversations going on, because in our polarized climate, it is otherwise very difficult to see how anything productive moves forward. So I want to thank the speakers enormously for a great discussion, and thank the sponsors, the LERA, and everyone who set this up. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. This was great. I apologize. I have to depart, but I'm oren.cass@americancompass.org and would welcome emails from anyone who wants to talk further.
Noted. Great. You may get some emails, judging from the
That'd be great.
comments.
You know, Damon and Oren, I couldn't help but think of a past president of LERA who was named George Shultz. And I thought, too bad George Shultz isn't still alive and younger to continue this conversation between the two of you. Because it was really so substantive, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having us. It was good. And thank you, Damon.
Thank you, Cindy, for doing a great job.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.